On the night of July 29th, 2026, a drone slips through the dark over the Egyptian coastline and slams into a gas tanker docked at the port of Damietta. Flames rise over the Mediterranean. This is the first time the war has touched Egyptian soil. No one claims responsibility. But everyone understands what just happened. A war that was never supposed to touch this country just did. 6 months ago, this began as a lightning strike meant to end in weeks. Instead, it has outlived a ceasefire, survived a fragile peace deal, and now it's spreading, pulling in nations that wanted nothing to do with it. So the question tonight isn't just what happened in Egypt, it's what comes next. Because Israel is standing at a decision point that could reshape the entire Middle East for generations, and depending on which path it chooses, the consequences may not be reversible. To understand how we got here, look at just the last 72 hours. Early on July 29th, American CENTCOM forces launched what officials called a heavy wave of strikes inside Iran, hitting military command centers, missile and drone production facilities, and a coastal surveillance site on Chesham Island in the Persian Gulf. Iranian state media reported casualties on the island, including strikes near the strait's narrowest point. Iran answered almost immediately. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps launched a barrage of ballistic missiles aimed at American forces stationed across the region. An attack CENTCOM says it intercepted in full. But the retaliation didn't stop there. A strike hit a Chinese-linked building in northern Kuwait, killing a worker. Jordan's air defenses shot down 5 Iranian missiles over its own territory. And then came Egypt, a drone hitting a gas tanker at the port of Damietta, marking the first time this conflict has directly touched Egyptian soil. Israel's own air force remains active throughout, continuing strikes tied to the broader campaign against Iranian military infrastructure. None of these countries chose this war. Kuwait, Jordan, and Egypt are now absorbing the fallout of a conflict between 2 other nations, and that alone tells you how quickly a regional war can outgrow its original borders. Why is this happening now? Because the fragile peace built in June is falling apart. On June 14th, American and Iranian negotiators signed a memorandum of understanding meant to stabilize a ceasefire that had held since April. But the deal never resolved the core dispute, access through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most vital and vulnerable oil corridors on Earth. By early July, Iran was already testing that agreement, firing on commercial vessels attempting to pass through. The strikes we're seeing now are the collapse of that fragile arrangement playing out in real time. The immediate consequences are already visible. Shipping insurers are raising premiums on Gulf routes. Air defense systems across the region are on heightened alert, and diplomats in Washington, Riyadh, and Cairo are scrambling to contain a war that keeps finding new ways to expand. To understand why this war keeps reigniting instead of ending, we need to go back to where it began, and further back than that, to the decades of hostility that made it possible. Israel and Iran have been locked in confrontation since the 1979 revolution replaced a Western-aligned monarchy with a clerical government openly hostile to both Israel and the United States. For decades, that hostility played out through proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, militias in Iraq and Syria, rather than direct war. The 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was supposed to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions through inspections and restrictions. Israel never trusted it, and after the United States withdrew in 2018, the agreement steadily unraveled. Then came October 7th, 2023, and the war in Gaza that followed. Over the next 2 years, Israel systematically degraded Hamas and Hezbollah, Iran's 2 most powerful regional proxies. In April and October of 2024, Iran and Israel exchanged direct missile strikes for the first time in their history, a preview of what was coming. By early 2026, with its proxy network weakened and its nuclear program advancing, Iran looked more isolated and more exposed than at any point in decades. That's the backdrop for what happened on February 28, 2026. The Trump administration announced what it called major combat operations against Iran, launching a joint campaign with Israel targeting military, nuclear, and infrastructure sites across the country. The opening strike did something no one fully expected. It killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, ending his 36-year rule instantly. Iran responded with hundreds of missiles and drones fired across the region. 5 weeks of intense fighting followed before the United States and Iran agreed to a ceasefire on April 7th and 8th, one that included Israel. But ending the fighting didn't end the conflict. The weeks that followed became a standoff over the Strait of Hormuz, with both sides testing each other's limits, until mediators announced the Memorandum of Understanding on June 14th, meant to formalize the peace. It didn't hold. By July 6th and 7th, Iran was firing on commercial ships in the Strait, and the strikes we saw this week are the direct result. Meanwhile, inside Iran, something equally significant was happening. On March 8th, the Assembly of Experts named Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, as the new supreme leader, a hereditary succession Iran's own revolutionary ideology officially rejects, reportedly pushed through under heavy pressure from the Revolutionary Guard Corps. That detail matters more than it first appears, because it tells us who is really steering Iran's response to this war, and why the country's posture has stayed so hardline. It also hints at why Israel sees this as strategy, not closure. That distinction, strategy over closure, is the key to understanding everything Israel has done since February. To grasp it, you have to look past the headlines about strikes and casualties and into the deeper logic driving this war. Start with the military picture. On paper, Israel holds a commanding advantage. Its air force has operated over Iranian skies with what analysts describe as effective air superiority, and its intelligence services have repeatedly demonstrated the ability to locate and eliminate senior Iranian commanders, including, in the war's opening moments, the supreme leader himself. That's the kind of dominance most militaries only dream of achieving against a state the size of Iran. But here's the contrast that matters. Battlefield dominance has not translated into strategic closure. Iran's missile production, its drone capability, and its network of regional proxies have proven far more resilient than pre-war intelligence assessments expected. Despite months of strikes on command centers and weapons factories, Iran is still launching coordinated attacks on Kuwait, on Jordan, and now, apparently, on Egypt. In other words, Israel keeps winning the individual battles. It has not yet won the war. That gap between tactical success and strategic outcome is why some strategists describe Israel's approach not as a single campaign to end Iran's threat, but as a policy of periodic degradation, a deliberate, repeated effort to push Iranian capability backward every time it starts to rebuild, rather than eliminate it once and for all. The logic here is blunt. If Iran cannot be permanently disarmed, it can at least be kept perpetually behind. That logic extends directly into the strikes themselves. Israeli and American targeting has focused heavily on Revolutionary Guard-linked industrial sites and nuclear-related infrastructure, facilities tied not to any single battle, but to Iran's long-term capacity to rebuild its weapons programs. This isn't about winning this week's headlines. It's about denying Iran the tools it would need to threaten the region again in 5 years. Then there's the economic dimension, and it may be the most consequential of all. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply through a channel just a few dozen kilometers wide. Iran doesn't need to close it entirely to cause damage, it only needs to make shipping companies afraid to use it. And that's exactly what's happened. Attacks on commercial vessels earlier this month have already triggered fuel shortages in parts of Asia and rattled global energy markets, proving that a regional war can instantly become a global economic event. This war is also becoming a live testing ground for military technology that will shape conflicts far beyond the Middle East. Missile interception rates, drone tactics, and real-time coordination between American and Israeli forces are being refined under real combat conditions rather than simulations. Every intercepted missile and every successful strike quietly generates lessons that will influence military doctrine for years to come. Defense planners in Washington and Jerusalem are already quietly studying this war for what it teaches about the next one. Diplomatically, Israel is playing a quieter game. While the public war unfolds through airstrikes and missile intercepts, a parallel track is developing behind closed doors, deepening security coordination between Israel and Gulf Arab states who share its concern about Iran, even without formal recognition or public alliance. Saudi Arabia's willingness to join strikes on Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, even while urging restraint in public, hints at where this quiet alignment may be heading next. And underneath all of it sits a strategic clock that many analysts believe is shaping Israel's decisions in real time. Some describe it as a narrowing corridor, a shrinking window in which strikes against Iran's nuclear and missile programs remain feasible, before Iranian reconstruction outpaces what diplomacy or deterrence can contain. If that window is closing, it would help explain why Israel appears willing to keep striking, even as the war spreads into new countries and new risks. So here's the real contrast beneath the public narrative. Officially, this war is framed as defeating a nuclear threat. Strategically, it looks more like an open-ended campaign of degradation, with no clearly defined endpoint, a war built to be managed indefinitely rather than won outright. That narrowing corridor, that sense of a closing window, is not just shaping Israel's decisions. It's reshaping the entire region around it, and reactions are pouring in from every direction. Internationally, the response has been anything but unified. European governments have generally urged a return to negotiated constraints on Iran's nuclear and missile programs, arguing that a durable diplomatic framework, not open-ended strikes, is the only way to permanently reduce the risk of wider war. Washington sees it differently. the Trump administration has framed its strikes as continuing acts of collective self-defense, part of an unbroken response to decades of Iranian-backed aggression rather than the start of a new war. That framing has triggered its own domestic argument. With critics in Washington questioning whether the campaign complies with existing war powers law, a debate the administration firmly rejects. Russia and China have taken a quieter path, calling for restraint at the United Nations while avoiding any direct involvement, even as both continue purchasing discounted Iranian oil. A reminder that public calls for calm often mask separate economic interests. Neither power appears eager to be pulled directly into a war that could threaten their own valuable energy relationships or shipping routes. Alliances across the region are shifting in more complicated ways than they first appear. Saudi Arabia offers the clearest example. It has joined the United States in striking Iranian-backed militias inside Iraq, a direct contribution to the broader campaign against Tehran's proxy network. Yet at the same time, Saudi officials have privately pressed Washington to pursue de-escalation, telling American counterparts the kingdom cannot absorb the economic shock of a long regional war. That's the core contradiction defining this entire moment. Quiet military cooperation against Iran, paired with real, growing anxiety about where that cooperation ultimately leads. Markets are responding to that anxiety in real time. Shipping insurers have raised premiums across Gulf routes as vessels increasingly avoid the Strait of Hormuz altogether. Oil prices have grown more volatile with every new incident, and fuel shortages have already reached parts of Asia that depend heavily on Gulf energy exports. For economies thousands of miles from the fighting, this war is no longer a distant headline. It's a line item on their energy bill. Refineries in South and East Asia, which depend on steady Gulf shipments, have already had to ration supply and search for costlier alternative routes, a ripple effect that started with a handful of missile strikes half a world away. Militarily, the United States has been visibly reinforcing its posture in the region, deploying additional fighter squadrons and refueling aircraft rather than drawing down. That's not the posture of a country expecting a quick resolution. It's the posture of a country preparing for a conflict that could still expand, and the expansion keeps finding new fronts. Egypt's Damietta port, Jordan's intercepted missiles, and the strike inside Kuwait all mark territory this war had not touched before this month. Meanwhile, two older fronts remain far from settled. In Lebanon, a fragile truce continues to fray, including a Hezbollah drone strike on an Israeli armored vehicle inside the southern buffer zone. In Gaza, Israel continues enforcing its buffer zone along the so-called Yellow Line, maintaining pressure on Hamas even as the humanitarian toll from continued strikes keeps rising. Civilian casualties from strikes in Gaza continue to draw international scrutiny, adding diplomatic pressure onto a government already stretched thin across multiple borders. Israel, in other words, is no longer managing one war. It's managing three simultaneously, each with its own risks, its own timeline, and its own capacity to spiral out of control. The long-term consequence may be the most significant of all. A new regional security architecture is quietly forming, one built not on formal treaties or public alliances, but on shared threat perception. Countries that have never officially recognized Israel are increasingly aligning with it in practice, driven less by diplomacy than by a common fear of what an emboldened, or a desperate, Iran might do next. Whether that informal alignment hardens into something lasting, or collapses under the weight of this war's unpredictability, may be one of the most important and most consequential open questions the entire region now faces. Every one of those mounting pressures, military, economic, and diplomatic, is now pushing toward the same unresolved question. Where does this actually go from here? No one can say for certain, and it's important to separate confirmed fact from informed analysis here, but based on current trends, statements from officials, and expert assessment, several distinct paths stand out, each with very different consequences for the region and for the world economy that depends on it. The first is controlled escalation. In this scenario, Israel and the United States intensify strikes on Iran's remaining nuclear and missile infrastructure, treating the recent widening of the war as justification for a more aggressive campaign rather than a reason for restraint. Analysts consider this moderately to highly likely given the trajectory of the past 2 weeks. The most probable trigger would be another Iranian attack on shipping, or on a third country like Egypt or Jordan. The risk is severe, a full multi-front war drawing in Hezbollah, Iraqi militias, and Gulf states simultaneously. The potential reward is equally significant, a real and possibly lasting reduction in Iran's ability to threaten the region, potentially setting back its nuclear and missile programs by years rather than months. The second path is negotiated stabilization. Here, a reinforced version of the June Memorandum of Understanding takes hold, this time backed by genuine verification mechanisms rather than vague commitments. This scenario carries moderate likelihood. largely dependent on whether Saudi-style pressure for de-escalation gains real traction in Washington and Tehran alike. It would most likely be triggered by mutual exhaustion or by energy markets becoming too unstable for any side to tolerate further disruption. The risk here is that hawks on both sides view any settlement as incomplete, undermining its durability. The opportunity, however, is substantial. A stabilized Strait of Hormuz, calmer global energy markets, and a reduced likelihood that Kuwait, Jordan, or Egypt are drawn any further into a conflict they never chose. The third path is more dramatic, and less likely, but impossible to dismiss entirely: fragmentation inside Iran itself. Continued strikes targeting senior leadership, combined with the legitimacy problems surrounding Mojtaba Khamenei's contested hereditary succession, could destabilize the Revolutionary Guard's grip on power from within. Some analysts point to Iran's own restive Kurdish opposition groups as a potential accelerant, a Western front that could open if central authority weakens further. This scenario remains the lowest probability path today, according to most current assessments, but it is rising steadily, not falling. The risk is a chaotic, unpredictable transition inside a nuclear-capable state, with no guarantee that whatever replaces the current leadership would be any less hostile. The opportunity, from Israel's perspective, is the removal of a threat it has prioritized for decades, potentially without the enormous cost of a full-scale invasion or prolonged occupation. The fourth and perhaps most realistic near-term path is simply more of the same, a frozen, high-tempo conflict that never fully resolves into either war or peace. Strikes, near misses, and partial diplomacy continue on a rolling basis, much as they have since April. This scenario currently carries by far the highest short-term likelihood, based purely on the observable pattern of the last several months. Its risk is quieter than outright war, but no less serious: the slow normalization of a permanent low-grade conflict, punctuated by periodic shocks like the one Egypt just experienced. Its advantage is that it avoids the worst-case scenario of total regional war, even as it avoids any real resolution, leaving the underlying dispute over Iran's nuclear ambitions and Hormuz access effectively unsettled, ready to reignite whenever the next incident occurs. None of these outcomes are guaranteed, and credible analysts disagree on which is most probable. What virtually all of them agree on is this: the decisions made in the coming months, not years, will shape the region's balance of power for a generation, long after this week's headlines are forgotten. So let's return to where we started, on a burning tanker at an Egyptian port that had never been part of this war before. That single incident was never really about Egypt. It was a symptom of a much larger decision Israel is quietly working through, one with consequences that will outlast this particular news cycle by years, if not decades, and one that will keep drawing in new countries for as long as it remains unresolved. The bigger lesson here is one that applies far beyond this one particular conflict. In this one region, military dominance and strategic victory are not the same thing. Israel has demonstrated extraordinary tactical capability throughout this war, striking with precision, achieving air superiority, and eliminating senior Iranian leadership when it mattered most. And yet, 6 months in, Iran is still striking back. The war is still spreading, and the strategic outcome remains genuinely undecided. That gap between winning battles and winning the war is the story underneath every headline this year. The key takeaway is this: the region's future increasingly depends less on any single strike or any single battlefield, and more on whether escalation can still be converted into something durable before it becomes irreversible. Every additional country pulled into this conflict, Kuwait, Jordan, and now Egypt, makes that conversion harder, and makes the frozen high-tempo path more likely than either a decisive military victory or a genuinely lasting peace. It also means that countries with no real stake in the original dispute are now absorbing real costs in damaged infrastructure, disrupted trade, and lost lives, simply because they happen to sit near this widening conflict. There are specific developments worth watching closely in the weeks ahead. Watch the fate of the June Memorandum of Understanding, and whether it can be meaningfully reinforced or whether it quietly collapses for good. Watch for any further attacks on shipping or on additional third countries, since each one raises the odds of full regional escalation. Watch Mojtaba Khamenei's grip on power inside Iran, since his legitimacy problems may matter as much as any battlefield outcome. And watch Israel's own domestic politics, where sustained multi-front pressure and a persistent protest movement are testing the government's stability from within, even as it wages war on 3 fronts abroad. None of these threads exist in isolation. They're all connected, feeding into the same central decision Israel now faces, one that will define the Middle East's balance of power for years to come, regardless of which path is ultimately chosen. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you were advising Israel's leadership right now, Knowing what you know about the costs of escalation and the risks of restraint, which path would you choose? And more importantly, could you live with what that choice might cost the region next?